Yeah, but I think the way you understand it is to realize something that it took me a long time finally to acknowledge, that maybe you are dealing with people who simply don't have universal principles. They have particularist desires. I want what's good for my group. And for my group, free speech is good. I want what's bad for that group. And for that group, suppression and muzzles are good. I think that's genuinely what it boils down to. It's not that they're hypocrites. It's like saying, and you get this all the time in a first grade classroom, the Puritans were hypocrites because they fled England seeking religious liberty, and yet they wouldn't give religious liberty to other people. Wrong. They were not seeking religious liberty in the abstract. They were seeking it for themselves. They were seeking to practice what they believed to be the proper Christian religion. At no time did they say, and we want to be a haven for all people who have oddball ideas. They never said that. So they were not hypocrites at all. And likewise, I think in this, maybe the left are not hypocrites because they genuinely don't believe in free speech. They never said they did. I mean, well, their parents said they did. And maybe their young grandparents in the early 60s said they did. But that was a long time ago. I mean, that's like saying that Alan Greenspan is an Ayn Randian because he wrote for the newsletter in the mid-60s.
That was a clip from the Tom Woods Show at the time of this recording almost 2 years ago. But it represents a trend in sort of common ethical thought that's been developing since then and is still quite common, unfortunately. If you're looking to see the whole interview that it was taken from, there will be a link in the description as well. Now, the tendency that he's referring to here is really what I want to talk about today, and also the importance of the inverse. And that is, I want to talk about the importance of having solid ethical principles at the basis of our thinking, rather than having, as Tom Woods said, having particularist desires, just having certain end goals that we want to strive for, and then having whatever kind of ethical reasoning we want to back them up, to justify what we want to do. So this also comes up because I want to discuss a little bit about the recent news involving Patreon. But we'll get to that a bit later. First, I want to outline the general importance of abstract principles, and then what happens when you disregard these ethical principles. So, just like any other system of inquiry or system of thought, or what we might generally, in the philosophical sense, call a science, ethics is a practice of finding true conclusions through a methodical thought process, right? Through a process of logic. Any logician will point to the importance of axioms or first principles. In abstract logic, we have the principle of non-contradiction, right? So that no proposition can be both true and false in the same way at the same time. We also have the law of the excluded middle term, that any proposition is either true or false. It can't be neither, right? There's no middle term there. And in any field of study, we have to have some kind of method. Right? We have to have some starting place. We have to have some first principles. Ethics is no different. So, by analogy, let's look to, for example, if you're going to have, say, a principled empirical science, you have to have some rules for evidence. You have to have some basic laws of what is possible and what's not. You have to have some basic outlines for what is the domain of study. Right? So you're not going to be trying to figure out, using the methods of biology, say, trying to figure out things about the attraction due to gravity between inert bodies. Right? It's just not within the domain of study. Right? You're not going to be using the right kinds of tools. Further, you're not going to be asking. You're not going to come to conclusions first and then try to justify them by whatever means. Now, this is something that one can do in any of the empirical sciences. If you spend enough time on YouTube, you've seen people arguing that the Earth is flat, right? And they have impressive arguments to back up those conclusions. Now, they're incorrect arguments, clearly. And there's lots of videos arguing both sides of this, and there's plenty of videos, if you need to find them, debunking these flat earthers. Now, the problem that I mean to point to isn't that they're wrong, right? The problem I mean to point to is the methodology, which is beginning with a conclusion and then finding reasons to justify it, whatever those reasons might be. Those can be contradictory reasons. It doesn't matter. So you might find a flat earther who points to the apparent lack of curvature in the horizon, in certain light conditions or at a certain angle or what have you. You might find a flat earther pointing to apparent lack of curvature by the distance we can see, right? Now, these have alternate explanations, and it's not like they're completely solid arguments that can't be refuted. Of course they can be refuted, but what's being done here clearly is not gathering as much evidence as we can and then coming to a conclusion based on that evidence, which is generally the rule for empirical sciences. In a similar way, the rule for largely a priori sciences, so metaphysical sciences generally, is to begin with incontrovertible principles and then move to particular conclusions based on certain circumstances. This is how ethics works. What we don't want to do is find certain conclusions that we like and then work backwards to try to justify them. Now, what Tom Woods was pointing out is a particular tendency on the political left to do this sort of thing. So that free speech is, in particular, he says, well, free speech is useful when it promotes our values, but it should be suppressed when it gives rise to hate speech, right? To put it relatively charitably. Now, I'm not to say that this is exclusive to the political left or it's universal on the political left. You'll find this in every sector of political discussion, especially political discussion. But even you'll find it in ethical discussion. If someone wants to justify the behavior that they want to carry out, then they're probably going to do so rather than begin with certain incontrovertible first principles and then apply those to a particular situation and then determine a right course of action. Now, that starting with first principles, applying them to a situation, and finding an outcome is the correct method of ethical deliberation, right, or practical deliberation, we can say. So, if we begin with first principles, right? So, if a framework of ethics, whatever that might be. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate of what the correct framework of ethics is in this video. I'm not going to determine that here. Whether you think that's deontological, whether it's a question of virtue, whether it's natural law, whether it's utilitarian concerns, whatever the case may be, and whatever conclusion we come to, we have a set of principles that we begin with. Then what we do is we analyze a particular situation. We find the details of that situation and we say, well, given these principles, what do I do in this situation? So this is going to involve a few things. It's first of all going to involve knowing the principles. And then it's going to involve understanding what is going on in the particular situation. How are we going to characterize the actions? How are we going to understand what's being done, what the details of the situation are, such that we can apply our principles? So to use an example, the question of whether to kill, say, in self-defense. Well, we have a principle, say, that murder is wrong. Right? This is fairly incontrovertible. Now, this isn't quite a first principle, strictly speaking, but we can start with this, assuming that it's generally not controversial, right? That murder is wrong. So we can assume murder is wrong, right? So if we're questioning a particular situation of killing in self-defense, right, the question isn't, right? Our principle doesn't say you shouldn't kill in self-defense, right? Or you should kill in self-defense. That's not really a principle. Or more so, it doesn't say kill this person in this particular circumstance. None of that. What it says is murder is wrong. You should not murder people. Okay. The question then arises, is this course of action that I am considering murder or not? So it's our ethical framework, it's our understanding of first principles that allows us to understand the situation under consideration. Without our ethical first principles, without our framework of understanding, what's going on is simply a series of what can barely even be called events. At that point, it simply becomes an action and a followed, a cause and an effect response. That's all. We can't characterize the action as anything other than something happened, then something else happened, then something else happened. It's hard even to say what those somethings are without some framework to interpret it through. Now, with even this tiny partial framework of murder is wrong, we can ask, all right, what's going on in this situation? Is anything in this situation, does it constitute murder? And if we can determine that it wouldn't be murder, at least based on that principle, we can say that it wouldn't be wrong to defend ourselves with lethal force, for example. Right? Again, I'm not going to get into the justification for this, but this is the method by which we would go about solving these questions. You have to start with some principles, something that's incontrovertible, axiomatic even, and then move on to particularize. We have to find what's true about the situation, and then we have to find out how to apply our principles to the situation, and that gives us a conclusion, right? That such and such action would be justified or would not be justified. By contrast, bye kid, bye Angel. By contrast, you can have a situation where you want to do something, right? Say you want to acquire a certain amount of money, for example. So that's your outcome. It's predetermined. So, okay, how do we justify it? Well, we know that it's hard to argue that stealing isn't wrong in general. So if we want to conclude that we should be able to acquire this amount of money or this lump of cash, whatever the case may be, then what we can do is we can define acquiring that money as not stealing. The little scene from Office Space comes to mind.
All right, so when the subroutine compounds the interest, right, it uses all these extra decimal places that just get rounded off. So we simplified the whole thing, and we round them all down and just drop the remainder into an account that we opened.
So you're stealing?
No, you don't understand. It's very complicated. It's aggregate, so I'm talking about fractions of a penny here. And over time, they add up to a lot.
Oh, okay. So you're gonna make a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's not yours?
Well, it becomes ours.
How is that not stealing?
In any case, we find this method to be quite useful. Jonathan Haidt, who's actually involved tangentially in this Patreon news item, is written about this as our sort of ordinary method for making ethical choices. Now, it being the ordinary method does not mean that it's the correct method. Right? It's not a logical or reasonable method for making any kind of choices or any kind of practical deliberation. If we're going to actually deliberate, we need to follow this appropriate method of going from principles, examining the particulars of the situation, and then coming to a particular conclusion based on our abstract principles. Now, how does this relate to Patreon? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail into what all has been going on with Patreon, but just briefly. Recently, Patreon banned a YouTuber who goes by the name Sargon of Akkad. His name is Carl Benjamin, from their platform for something offensive that he said on a stream off of Patreon's site, not on Patreon's platform. So this has given rise to a lot of controversy, whether Patreon made the right decision or not. Now, what I want to look at is how Patreon made this decision. Because I think that can shed light on whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision. Because if we find that they made the decision in the wrong way, we can say that they've done something wrong, even if by some principled understanding it may have wound up being the right decision, right? Which again, I'm not here to discuss. If we can determine that their methods of deciding on a course of action were wrong, were unjust, were illogical, then we can already determine that what they did was wrong, or that they are working with flawed principles, or, as I'm ultimately going to hopefully show, no principles. So what really drew my attention to this was another YouTuber named Matt Christensen, who I followed for a good long time, and I have a great deal of respect for just this reason. Who he was in contact with Patreon, and he had several questions with the representative about Patreon's trust and safety team and their methods for adjudication, and in general their policies. And when I say I have a lot of respect for Matt Christensen, I don't agree with him on everything, whether that's philosophically or politically or ethically or what have you. But what I do greatly respect is that in all the time that I've followed his videos back from his Skag 3 days, and when he was a gaming channel, which you'll have to go really back far on his channel to see that, he's always at least tried to be consistent in his principles. He's always tried incredibly well, usually with a good deal of success, to begin with abstract principles and come to a conclusion logically, whether that's in practical deliberation or coming to theoretical conclusions. And that's not something you find commonly on the internet, or even in sort of the YouTube sphere, or sadly even among some more academic ethicists. So when he was having this discussion with a Patreon representative on the phone, which there is no recording of this for legal reasons, but there is a transcript which I will link below in the description, as well as a link to his video explanation of the conversation, where he goes through some of the things that he uncovered in this discussion. One of the points that I think he may have, in his analysis, may have breezed over too quickly, but really informs our discussion here, is that Patreon's trust and safety team, when they decide what is and is not appropriate behavior for creators using their platform, the representative from Patreon consistently was insisting that all of their decisions are on a case-by-case basis. Now, that's not unacceptable from the outset. Of course, that's part of any process of practical deliberation, is considering particulars of any case, right? Because when you start with general abstract principles, you have to see what's going on in any particular case in order to know how to apply the principles. Now, the problem then was more and more throughout this interview, the representative from Patreon was not only insisting that these evaluations would have to be on a case-by-case basis, but that it was fundamentally subjective. And as much as Matt was able to press her on the issue, she could not provide a solid standard or a solid principle upon which these decisions are based. Several times when he asks, he gives hypothetical scenarios. Right? So he says, would this, if I did this, right? For example, one of the ones he gives is, if I were to do exactly the same thing that Sargon did, but in a private conversation, would that be acceptable? And the representative was unable to give an answer. She wasn't able to give an answer about a very particular situation, which, again, anyone whose job it is to apply, to make ethical decisions, essentially, right? Because that's what the trust and safety team is supposed to be doing. Anyone whose job it is to make these kinds of decisions, presumably would be able to answer at least give an idea of what the outcome would be in a hypothetical scenario, right? Be able to work through what would be the right outcome in any given situation. If you have solid principles and you're able to understand the situation, or even if you're able to ask clarifying questions about the situation, then you should be able to come to some conclusion. It's telling, I think, that the representative didn't ask clarifying questions very often about these situations, but rather asked, well, what was the context? Or asked about Matt's history as a creator. So it's not, in that case, about the particulars of the situation that makes it case by case, or makes it a subjective decision, but rather it's how they deal with a particular person. Right? They want to deal with a particular person in a particular way, fine. But the standards seem to be based on an outcome, rather than based on a principle, or based on a rule. She was unable to give any kind of indication of what an outcome would be for any given creator on the platform, say. Now, given the respect I have for Matt Christensen, and given the respect I have for this kind of ethical deliberative process, seeing this conversation made actually quite an impact. I was able to see what was really going on here, and I immediately saw this as an example of this very kind of thing that I wanted to point to. So we see this here as an example of precisely the wrong kind of ethical or practical deliberation. We see this as precisely an example of finding a conclusion that one wants based on maybe ideological reasons, maybe personal reasons, maybe political reasons, maybe monetary reasons. I don't know what the monetary situation would be for any of these particular creators, but something like that. Something like that could provide a reason, hypothetically. I don't know if that's the case. But coming to it for some reason other than applying one's principles, one's general abstract principles, to a particular case. And this brings us back to what Tom Wood said, and what we heard Tom Wood say at the beginning of the episode, which is that certain people don't think in terms of principles. They think in terms of their particularist desires. They want certain things, and they want to justify those things. And so they do. And that is not an ethical process. Right? And I don't mean by that it's specifically unethical to do so. More fundamentally, I mean that they are not doing ethics. They're not considering what is right and wrong. They're considering what they want, right? And what they want the outcome to be. So it's not so much immoral, even. It doesn't even reach to the level of being immoral. It becomes amoral. It's completely dismissing the question of what's right and what's wrong and going for some other kind of practical decision-making process. So when we are doing ethics, when we're really trying to figure out what's right and wrong, we really do have to start with something abstract, something general, these first principles. Then we can follow that where it leads by understanding what the particulars of the situation are, given those principles, and then coming to a conclusion. All right, so that's all I have to say about the general academic part of this discussion. The rest of this video is going to be more what my interaction my plans going forward, given all this. So if you're just here for the philosophical part, then I will see you next time. But if you are interested in more of what I'm going to be doing going forward, then, well, here we go. I do, given all this, and given what we've learned about Patreon, I do have a Patreon as of this recording. But that won't be for long. I'm planning on deleting my Patreon by the time this video goes live. So by the time you're watching this, I will no longer be on Patreon. Given their blatant disregard for ethical norms, I can't in good conscience, or even in good practical consideration, utilize their platform or associate with their platform anymore. However, also, it's worth noting, my Patreon was actually relatively new. I made it just a few weeks before this news began to break. So this isn't as much of a loss for me as it is for some who, for example, people like Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, who make, at least the last time it was their numbers were public, made millions on Patreon. They're also deciding to close down their Patreon accounts as of the date of the release of this video, which is January 15th, 2019. All of this is together inspiring me to do likewise. Unfortunately, there isn't much of an alternative online, and part of the problem seems to be PayPal, although I am remaining on PayPal for the moment. I'm not sure what their... I don't have nearly as much detail about their procedures and their thought process. So if you are interested in contributing to the work I do, feel free to contact me, feel free to comment, and I can get you information for that. I am going to be starting a Subscribestar account, which should be active by the time that this video goes live. Unfortunately, again, due to PayPal, Subscribestar is, as of this recording at least, not taking new donations. But I've been assured that I've been following them pretty closely, that they are in the process of finding a new payment processor, so hopefully that should be available soon. And when it is, I invite you to subscribe there, and I'll have a reward system, a Patreon-esque sort of reward system there for contributions to videos, for individualized assistance for any kind of philosophical topics, educational type stuff, that sort of thing. For more details, do check out the Subscribestar. There will be a link in the description. But otherwise, if any of you viewers have any ideas about where to go from here in terms of any kind of monetization platforms similar to Patreon, something like that, feel free to comment. Feel free to respond. I'm open to taking a look. This is thankfully not my primary source of income. I do teach full time. So, but this does take a considerable amount of time and effort. So if you do want to contribute, we'll find a way. Anyway, I'm hoping that this video was instructive, and that we were able to at least get some useful information and learn something from this particular case of what seems to me to be a fundamentally unethical company. So, with that, I will see you next time.